In the busy city of Mavoko, life never slowed down. Cars honked, traders shouted, and children ran through the narrow streets. Everyone was chasing something: money, love, power, or just survival. In the middle of all this noise lived Adana, a woman who never liked to draw attention to herself. She was the kind of person you could pass by without noticing. Yet those who truly knew her understood that she carried a strength far greater than she ever showed. But her quiet nature was often overshadowed by the loud, boastful presence of her husband, Kelechi. He walked through the city with his chest high, laughing louder than anyone, always making sure people saw him. To outsiders, it looked like Kelechi was the king of his home, the one in charge, the one who made everything happen. But behind the closed doors of their marriage, it was Adana who held the real weight of their lives together. She managed the house, handled responsibilities, and kept their world from falling apart. Yet, she rarely received credit for it. In a city where reputation was everything, people only saw the surface. They saw Kelechi's pride but never her silent endurance. That silence, however, was about to change. When Adana first married Kelechi, she truly believed she had found the man who would love and protect her for the rest of her life. He was charming, full of promises, and spoke sweet words that made her heart feel safe. He told her she was his queen, his treasure, and that together they would build a beautiful future. For a while she believed him. She dreamed of a happy home, children laughing in the yard, and a husband who would stand by her side through every storm. But those dreams began to fade quickly. Once the wedding celebrations were over, Kelechi's true face began to show. The sweet words turned into sharp commands. The laughter they once shared became arguments filled with his anger. Slowly, he began to treat Adana not as a partner but as a possession. He wanted her silent when he spoke, invisible when he entertained friends, and obedient to his every demand. He acted as if she owed her entire existence to him, as if without him she was nothing. Adana tried to endure it at first. She told herself it was just stress, that maybe marriage was supposed to be hard. She worked harder to please him, hoping that her patience would soften his heart. But nothing changed. The more she gave, the more he took. He criticized the way she dressed, the way she cooked, even the way she breathed when she was upset. Each insult chipped away at her spirit, yet she held on, refusing to let her family or friends see her pain. Behind closed doors she lived in silence, hiding her tears in the pillow at night. To the outside world they looked like a couple with everything, a house, status, and wealth. But inside that house was a woman slowly drowning in lies. Adana had entered the marriage with love, but what she got in return was control, humiliation, and the cruel reminder that Kelechi never saw her as his equal, only as someone to rule over. Deep down she began to wonder if this was all her life would ever be. For years, Adana carried her pain in silence. She had grown used to swallowing her tears, hiding her bruised heart, and pretending everything was fine whenever people asked about her marriage. But deep inside, the weight was slowly crushing her. Every insult Kelechi threw at her felt like another stone added to her chest. Every time he ignored her presence or flaunted his betrayals in front of her, a part of her spirit broke away. She had promised herself on her wedding day that she would endure anything for love, but what she faced was not love, it was humiliation. One evening, after yet another argument where Kelechi dismissed her worth as if she were nothing, Adana locked herself in the bathroom. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her once bright eyes had grown dull, her smile had disappeared, and the joy that once lit her face was gone. For the first time she admitted to herself that she was not living, she was merely surviving. The thought shook her to the core. That night, while the city of Mavoko buzzed with its usual chaos outside, Adana made a decision that changed everything. She pulled out her hidden papers, the ones she had quietly been preparing for months, and filled in the final details. Her hands trembled as she signed her name, not out of fear but out of freedom. Filing for divorce was not easy. It meant facing gossip, judgment, and the wrath of Kelechi. But it also meant she would no longer live as a shadow in her own home. The next morning, as she walked to the courthouse with the papers tucked safely in her bag, her steps felt lighter than they had in years. She wasn't smiling yet, but her heart carried something new: hope. For the first time in a long time, Adana felt like she was finally taking her life back. It wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and the future she deserved. When the court summons finally reached Kelechi, He didn't react with shock or fear the way most men would. Instead he laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that echoed through the house. To him this was nothing but a joke, another chance to remind Adana that she could never win against him. He held the papers in his hand as if they were a comedy script, waving them around in front of his friends and boasting, "Can you believe this woman thinks she can leave me? She won't last a week without me." His friends joined in the laughter, clapping him on the back, feeding his pride. In Kelechi's mind, divorce wasn't the end of his control. It was a stage where he could perform, a place where he could humiliate Adana publicly and prove once again that he was the one in power. He pictured the courtroom filled with people, neighbors, relatives, even strangers, watching as he mocked her, painted her as a weak woman, and signed away the marriage with a smirk. He didn't see divorce as a loss. He saw it as entertainment. Meanwhile, Adana's name became the subject of whispers in the community. People said she was foolish for challenging him, that no woman could stand against Kelechi's arrogance and come out victorious. And Kelechi fed on those whispers like fuel, becoming even more confident. He strutted around the city of Mavoko as though nothing could shake him, laughing louder, dressing sharper, and telling anyone who would listen how pathetic his wife was for thinking she could survive without his money, his name, his presence. But what Kelechi didn't know was that his laughter was only digging the hole deeper. Every boast, every careless insult, every loud declaration of superiority would soon come back to haunt him. For the moment, though, he was blind, too blinded by arrogance to see that the woman he had underestimated for years was quietly preparing for the day his mocking laughter would be silenced forever. The morning of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse in Mavoko buzzed with restless energy. From the steps outside to the crowded benches inside, the air was heavy with curiosity and gossip. People came not just for justice but for drama. Neighbors who had whispered about Adana's foolishness were eager to see her embarrassed. Family members who once advised her to endure for the sake of peace sat quietly, waiting to see if she would crumble. Even strangers had gathered, drawn by the promise of a public spectacle, because nothing traveled faster in Mavoko than the downfall of someone people thought was weak. The wooden benches creaked as the crowd shifted, whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads, saying Adana had no chance against a man like Kelechi. Others giggled behind their hands, predicting how the arrogant husband would mock her in front of the judge. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just a legal case. It was a stage, and everyone came to watch the drama unfold. As the clock ticked toward the hour, court officials moved briskly, arranging files, whispering instructions, and calling for order. The judge's seat remained empty, adding to the suspense. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the tapping of shoes, the cough of an old man, echoed louder than usual. It felt as though the walls themselves were waiting for the show to begin. For many in that courtroom, this wasn't about law or fairness. It was about seeing a woman who dared to challenge her husband fall flat on her face. They expected tears, begging, maybe even humiliation that would feed gossip for weeks. What none of them realized was that Adana was walking into this battle not as a broken woman, but as someone who had been silently gathering her strength for years. While the crowd waited for her downfall, fate was preparing to turn the story upside down in the most unexpected way. When Adana walked into the courtroom, the whispers grew louder. Heads turned, eyes followed her, and lips curled with pity or scorn. Some people whispered, "Poor woman, she doesn't know what she's doing." Others laughed quietly, calling her foolish for daring to challenge a man like Kelechi. In their eyes, she was walking into her own humiliation, a lamb heading straight to the slaughter. After all, Kelechi had money, charm, and the confidence of a man who always got his way. What chance did Adana have against him? But Adana didn't flinch. She didn't bow her head or quicken her steps. She walked slowly, gracefully, her calm expression betraying none of the storm inside. She wore a simple but elegant dress, not flashy, not meant to impress, but enough to show dignity. Her face was steady, her eyes clear. She looked nothing like a woman about to be destroyed. And yet, the people watching could not see the truth, that beneath her quiet exterior, she carried a strength no one expected. She took her seat quietly, ignoring the sideways glances and the pitying looks. While others saw weakness, she knew the power she held in her silence. For years, she had endured Kelechi's cruelty and the world's judgment. She had been underestimated, overlooked and pushed aside. But today was different. Today she was not here to fight with words or tears. She was here to let the truth speak for itself. Kelechi's friends in the audience smirked, exchanging knowing glances, already celebrating his victory. They thought Adana would leave the courtroom broken, mocked and smaller than ever. But as she sat there, calm and composed, it was as though she was holding a secret no one could read. The room saw a quiet woman, but what they didn't realize was that this same quiet woman was about to shake the entire courtroom with a single revelation. Kelechi's entrance into the courtroom was nothing short of a performance. He arrived late enough to make people turn their heads, yet early enough to show he was in control. Dressed in his finest suit, polished shoes shining under the lights, and a gold watch glinting on his wrist, he walked in as though the room already belonged to him. His shoulders were squared, his chin raised high, and his smile wide enough to show all his teeth. To him this wasn't a divorce hearing, it was his stage and he was the star. He moved through the rows with the confidence of a man who believed he could never lose. Every step was exaggerated, every gesture designed to remind everyone watching that he was powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. He reached out to shake hands with his friends seated in the crowd, laughing loudly at their jokes, even making a few of his own. The laughter rolled across the courtroom, blending with the whispers of those who admired his boldness. He sat down finally, spreading his arms across the back of the bench as though he were sitting in his own living room. From where Adana sat, she could feel the arrogance radiating off him. He didn't glance her way, not even once. To him she was already defeated. He smirked, tapping his pen on the table, as though waiting for the judge to simply sign away the marriage so he could move on with his life and mock her later. The courtroom buzzed with the energy he brought in. Some admired his confidence, others shook their heads at his pride, but almost everyone believed the outcome would favor him. Kelechi believed this was his victory parade, not a trial. But what he didn't know was that his greatest humiliation was waiting just around the corner. His prideful entrance would soon be remembered not as the mark of a winner, but as the calm before the storm that would silence his laughter forever. When the divorce papers were finally placed in front of Kelechi, he leaned back in his chair as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. He didn't even bother to read them carefully. With a smirk playing on his lips, he picked up the pen and twirled it between his fingers, enjoying the way the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For him this wasn't a serious matter, it was entertainment. He glanced at his friend sitting in the audience and winked before lowering the pen to the page. Without a single pause, he signed his name in bold strokes, as if his signature was a weapon that would crush Adana once and for all. "She won't survive without me," he announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. His voice carried across the courtroom, drawing a wave of chuckles from those who believed him. He leaned back with a laugh, tapping the table proudly, as if the entire case was already over. The arrogance in his face was impossible to miss. He sat there, chest puffed out, certain that he had just proven his superiority. To him, signing those papers was not a defeat. It was a declaration that he was the powerful one, the man who had chosen to let her go. He imagined people would talk about how weak Adana was, how foolish she had been to walk away from a man like him. The thought of her struggling without his name, without his so-called protection, only made him laugh harder. But while he laughed, Adana sat quietly, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't even flinch at his cruel joke. And that silence carried more weight than his arrogance. What Kelechi failed to see was that every stroke of his pen, every careless word he spoke, was pushing him closer to a moment that would turn his pride into regret. The papers he signed so easily were not the end of her life, they were the beginning of his downfall. The room grew still when the judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The laughter that had filled the courtroom moments before faded into silence. Everyone leaned forward, sensing that something important was about to happen. Even those who had been whispering and mocking Adana fell quiet, their eyes fixed on the man who held the papers in his hands. His calm, steady voice broke the silence as he began to read the financial statements. At first, the words sounded routine: figures, documents, accounts. But then there was a shift. The numbers were not small, not ordinary, not what anyone expected. The crowd leaned in closer, straining to catch every word. The judge's tone never changed, measured, calm, professional. But the weight of his words grew heavier with every sentence. He was not describing Kelechi's wealth, as everyone had assumed. Instead, he was reading out details that pointed to Adana. Behind the judge's voice, You could almost hear the collective gasp of the audience as the truth began to take shape. People exchanged puzzled glances. Some frowned, whispering to their neighbors, unsure if they had heard correctly. Could it be possible that the quiet, overlooked wife they had pitied all this time was the one holding the real power? Kelechi shifted in his seat, the smirk fading slightly as he tried to process the words. He leaned forward, gripping the table, his arrogance slipping into confusion. He had walked in convinced that this would be a quick victory, a day to laugh at his wife's weakness. But the judge's calm voice was stripping away his illusions piece by piece. Every word carried the weight of truth, and though the judge spoke gently, it landed like thunder in the courtroom. The silence that followed between sentences was louder than Kelechi's earlier laughter. For the first time he realized this hearing might not end the way he had imagined. And for the first time Adana's calm, steady silence began to look less like weakness and the judge's next words fell like lightning in the silent courtroom. With the same calm tone, he announced that Adana was not only financially independent, but also the sole owner of several thriving businesses. She owned properties scattered across Mavoko and beyond, accounts filled with more money than most people in the room could even imagine. The papers in his hand didn't just prove she could stand on her own, they proved she was far more successful and wealthier than Kelechi had ever been. For a moment no one moved. The crowd sat frozen, as if time itself had stopped. The same people who had whispered about Adana's supposed weakness now stared at her with wide eyes, struggling to believe what they were hearing. A woman they thought was fragile, powerless, and dependent was revealed to be stronger and richer than the man who had mocked her for years. Gasps rippled through the benches, followed by stunned murmurs. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, others turned to look at Kelechi, eager to see his reaction. His proud smile had disappeared completely. His eyes darted toward Adana, searching for an explanation, but she remained still, her calm expression betraying nothing. The revelation cut deeper than any insult. For years he had boasted about being the provider, the powerful one, the man who made Adana who she was. But in a single moment the truth destroyed that illusion. He had been standing on shaky ground all along, blinded by arrogance, while Adana quietly built an empire of her own. People whispered her name with a new kind of respect. Adana, the woman who once seemed invisible, had just turned the entire courtroom upside down without saying a word. The power had shifted and everyone could feel it. What was meant to be her humiliation had transformed into his greatest shame. And for the first time, Kelechi realized that the woman he thought he controlled was far beyond his reach. She had already risen higher than he could ever dream. Kelechi sat frozen in his chair, his pen still resting on the table where he had so proudly signed the papers moments earlier. The confident laughter that had once filled the courtroom was gone. It was replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on his chest. His smirk slipped away as the truth echoed in his mind. He had owned nothing compared to Adana. For years he had strutted through Mavoko like a king, bragging about his wealth, mocking his wife, and convincing everyone that she was nothing without him. But now, in front of the entire city, that illusion had been shattered. The judge's words rang in his ears like a cruel reminder of his pride. Businesses, properties, accounts, all belonging to the woman he had treated like a servant. Every time he had told her she was worthless, she had been quietly building a fortune that dwarfed his own. The humiliation burned through him. He wanted to laugh again, to cover his shame with arrogance, but his throat was dry, his voice trapped. The people who once looked at him with admiration now stared with pity, even disgust. His friends who had cheered for him avoided his eyes. The same crowd that had expected Adana to walk out broken now leaned toward her with respect. It was as though the world had flipped upside down in an instant. Adana didn't gloat, didn't speak a single word. She simply sat still, her calm presence louder than any speech. And that silence cut deeper than his humiliation. He had mocked her for being quiet, but now her quiet strength was the very thing that crushed him. For the first time in his life, Kelechi realized that power was not in the noise, the money he flaunted or the pride he carried. It was in the dignity Adana had carried all along. And in that moment, as his laughter turned into silence, he felt the sharp sting of regret begin to take root. The courtroom that had once been filled with laughter and mocking suddenly turned into a sea of gasps and whispers. People leaned forward on the wooden benches, their eyes wide, their mouths open in shock. Just moments ago, many of them had pitied Adana, convinced she was walking into her own destruction. Some had whispered that she was foolish, others laughed at the idea of her challenging Kelechi. But now every single one of them sat in stunned silence, realizing they had been wrong all along. The murmurs grew louder, rolling through the room like a wave. "Did you hear that? She owns businesses?" One woman whispered, clutching her neighbor's arm. "Properties too? More than Kelechi?" Another gasped, shaking her head in disbelief. Respect replaced pity, admiration replaced mockery. It was as if the entire city of Mavoko had witnessed a miracle. Adana, the woman they had all underestimated, had risen before their eyes. Kelechi sat stiffly, his face pale, while all eyes drifted toward his wife. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even turn her head to acknowledge the stares. She simply sat there, calm and composed, as if she had been prepared for this moment all along. That quiet dignity only made the crowd's respect grow deeper. For years people had believed Kelechi's story, that he was the strong one, the provider, the man holding everything together. But now the truth was clear. The power balance had shifted in a single moment, and it was Adana who held the higher ground. Her silence spoke louder than his arrogance ever had. The whispers grew into a low buzz, the kind of sound that carried far beyond those courtroom walls. By the time the hearing ended, Mavoko would be buzzing with her name. Stories of her strength and hidden power would spread like wildfire. And for the first time, the people who once doubted her would begin to look at her not with pity, but with awe. Adana sat in the courtroom with her hands gently folded in her lap, her face calm and steady. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, and didn't try to explain herself to anyone. There was no need. The truth had already spoken louder than she ever could. While Kelechi shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pride melting away before the eyes of the crowd, Adana remained still, like a mountain unmoved by the storm. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was power, the kind of power that doesn't need noise to be heard. People watched her closely, waiting to see if she would celebrate or mock the man who had humiliated her for years. But she didn't. She didn't smile in victory or throw sharp words his way. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her presence shine brighter than anything Kelechi could have ever imagined. That calmness spoke volumes. It told the world she didn't need revenge or loud declarations. She had already won. For years, Kelechi had called her worthless, had told her she was nothing without him. He had laughed at her pain, mocked her silence, and treated her like a shadow. But now that very silence was the weapon that broke him. Every second she sat there without reacting was like a mirror reflecting his shame back at him. The people in the courtroom felt it too. They whispered to one another, not just about her wealth but about her strength. They realized that what made Adana powerful was not just her success, but the grace with which she carried it. She was living proof that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't shout. In that room her silence was louder than all the insults Kelechi had ever thrown. And in that silence, she reclaimed not only her dignity but also the respect of everyone who had ever doubted her. Kelechi could no longer hold his head high. The man who had entered the courtroom with pride, dressed in his finest suit and laughing loudly, now sat slumped in his chair. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, curved inward as if the weight of the truth had broken him. He lowered his head, unable to meet the eyes of the crowd that once admired him. For years he had mocked Adana, belittled her dreams, and laughed at her silence. But now, in front of everyone, he was the one humiliated. The sting of regret hit him harder than any punishment. He thought about the countless nights when Adana cried quietly in their home, the times she cooked for him only to receive insults, the days she worked tirelessly while he dismissed her efforts. He had told himself she was nothing, that without him she could not survive. But now, in the very place where he expected to watch her fall, he was forced to face the truth. She had never needed him. In fact, she had soared higher than he could ever reach. Whispers filled the courtroom, each one like a dagger to his pride. Some people shook their heads at him in disappointment, while others chuckled at the irony. The friends who once cheered him on now shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. Kelechi's arrogance had turned into a public lesson, one everyone would remember. Adana didn't even look at him. That hurt more than anything. Her silence wasn't just dignity. It was a sign that she no longer cared enough to fight with him. She had moved past the pain, while he remained trapped in his regret. In that moment, Kelechi realized that losing Adana wasn't his greatest failure. His greatest failure was never valuing her when he had the chance. And now the whole world had seen him lose the one thing he could never buy back, her respect. Adana walked out of the courtroom that day with her head held high, not just as a woman who had won her freedom, but as someone who had proven her worth to the world. The same people who once whispered against her now looked at her with respect. She was no longer the quiet wife who endured insults and pain in silence. She was a woman who had shown courage, patience, and wisdom in the face of humiliation. Every step she took outside that courtroom felt like the beginning of a new life. The chains that once held her down were gone, and in their place was a sense of pride and peace. Adana knew she didn't just win for herself. She became a voice for every woman who had ever been told she was nothing. Her story was proof that silence is not weakness, and endurance is not surrender. Sometimes strength grows quietly until the right moment comes to shine. As the crowd watched her leave, her story began to spread beyond the walls of the court. She became an example, a reminder that those underestimated often hold the greatest power. And though her marriage ended, Adana knew her journey was only just beginning. She was walking into a new chapter, one written not with tears or fear, but with strength, dignity, and hope. She didn't just survive. She rose, and in rising she inspired others to believe they could too.